coming out today. Thank you for changing the weather. Who knows what it'll be later on. So hopefully we won't get too much of this white crap. Maybe eventually it'll warm up and be nice out. Again, thank you for coming. Ethan Schmidt, Brett Gregory, and then Wade, will you stand up? We got a new member to the team this year, Wade Van Oningham, signed on with us as well. Working out at the Sigourney location, but it'll also be probably around a lot of your guys' farms, pulling data, trying to help out Brett, Ethan, and myself, just as we continue to stay busy, just trying to keep us moving faster and stuff like that. So, Wade, welcome to the team. Thank you, and definitely introduce yourself to everybody later on. So, a little about what we're going to talk about today. Kind of a little different format. Last year, normally in our books, we have a lot of just pretty general high-level analysis. This year we dove in a little bit deeper on some stuff, trying to put some numbers to some real uncertain times. I'm sure as all you guys looked at the markets today and last night, corn spiked over $7. Who knows if that's going to be a good thing or a bad thing, but in the short term, I guess, yeah, we'll take some $7 corn. It's a good thing. So, but yeah, then Katie McWhorter with Premier Crop, she's our Premier Crop account lead. She'll talk as well and try and dig into even some more uncertainty as to what we're seeing and how to try and better manage against it. So with that, I'm not going to stand around up here talking much longer. I'll turn it over to Brett. You start. So get started with it. We'll take a break, probably in between talks, and then take a break in between talks, and lunch should be here.
Most of you have seen me before, but Brett Gregory, work out of Sigourney, live up in Montezuma, just to kind of give you an idea. I kind of cover from Tama County clear down south of Ottumwa and about over here to Keota is kind of my area. So it's always interesting to get digging into this data at the end of the year and seeing what some of the other regions and things are doing compared to what I've been seeing. And when we look at this last year, there's a lot of there's as many questions that have came up based off what the data is showing versus what I was thinking. So maybe kind of dig into a little bit of that and try and figure out some whys to that. I know you guys have all seen these first few slides before, but it's just nice to give you an idea to refresh you of where we're at, kind of where things are happening and so forth. But pretty respectable year on the corn, very respectable on the beans. I think if most people would have known what the bean yields were going to be and the prices we'd have seen last fall, we probably wouldn't have had much corn data to talk about again this year, like last year after the derecho. But turns out very respectable for this year. Just on the rainfall, just to cover that, there again we were pretty close to average rainfall for the year. It's just most of it came in the couple driest months that we normally have in that June, July time frame. So, but you can see there was maybe a little more difference than in a couple areas than what there has been in the past as well. Corn averages, and there again, seems like when you get over there a little further east into that God's country area, they just kind of keep pulling that average up for us. But overall, pretty respectable, especially northwest there, when you start looking at the rainfall compared to some of the other regions. Planting dates. We've preached this for years. it's no surprise, and when weather and field conditions warrant, you guys get it done. This year was no exception. Half the corn acres were in by the 26th of April. This has been one of the big surprises to me. First half versus second half planting dates, we saw no decline in yield on first half versus second half, but you know, there again, I mean, a lot of that stuff got put in, that first half got put into dry dirt and didn't do anything until 3 weeks later, 2 weeks later, when we got some moisture and everything was come up at the same time. We really didn't see any significant yield loss until we get into that mid-May time frame there. Just to refresh your memory, or so you don't have to go back in some of them older books, this is just the historic first half versus second half yield comparisons for you guys. And the average date over the last 8 years, or 7, whatever is up there, is April 26th. So we were right on track this year with the 7 or 8 year average as far as getting things in the ground. That's maybe a little, just a summary, so you don't have to do the math. You know, about 7 bushel advantage by getting out there and getting it done when it's fit. So, we're going to start to dig a little deeper here. Yield by management zones. We're looking at 2021 versus the past 3 years average, and very trend line with where we've been, what we would have expected. And this is this is a summary of all the acres. The next thing I want to share with you here. So on a lot of these reports, we're going to get into looking at some variable rate versus a straight rate or a flat rate, whether it be planting or fertilizer, what have you. Even though it was flat rate planted and we've got management zones identified over here on the right hand side, you know, we've got some guys that maybe they variable rate plant, but their fertilizer, their anhydrous is straight rated, or vice versa. They're going out and variable rate and fertilizer, but they've still got an older ground drive planter. So that's kind of where some of this information's coming from, but just average populations by management zone, variable rate, you know, we're running about 4,500 seeds per acre average difference between all the zones. And if you look up there, I mean, we're saving quite a bit on those B and C zones compared to the guys that are running the straight rate planting. And we'll dig into some of the numbers here as far as how that benefits you here after a bit. Yield comparisons, there again, if you look at this, some of the numbers are maybe make you question a little bit why or what have you. You know, the A zone on variable rate planted was showing 2 bushel less than the acres that weren't variable rate planted, but overall we still are ahead of the game at the end of the day when we're saving on seed. Kind of condensed some of these things that we've looked at in the past as far as trends for population. Yield response to population, and there again, I mean, we need to keep in mind that we're looking at all hybrids and all management zones. So if we compare hybrid A at 34,000, that might be the target population in an A zone, and we take the next hybrid that's a fixed year hybrid, 34,000 might be the B zone. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind, and we can help you as we start getting ready for spring here with the different hybrids. When we're placing hybrids for specific fields, we can go in and run some queries and figure out the exact populations that we need to be running for that hybrid on that acre. As we're going through here, this is just kind of there again, summary of the hybrids or the seed companies and the acres that each company represents within the group's data. Then as we dig into the hybrids and back a little further back in your books, there's a full page list of these slides here as well. But this is the top 20 performing hybrids with a minimum of 20 acres. Just to throw out all the test plots and the quarter, half acre, whatever check scripts, whatever you want to call them, but kind of see where some of these hybrids rank out on an average compared to what your farm was, and see what's going on in the rest of the world. The next slide, digging a little deeper, minimum 200 acres and a minimum of 3 sites per hybrid. So you can see there that, well, that second hybrid, I mean, there were 10 fields and 200 acres, average 223. Just to give us a little more confidence in that hybrid, and figuring out, being able to take that and figure out where it needs to be placed and what populations to set at. And then this is just the top 20 most popular, so the most planted acres. And I like to use this once in a while, and I'm not trying to discriminate against any hybrid, any company, any dealer, whatever, but like we've talked about before, is buying a certain hybrid or buying from the brother-in-law in your best interest? Are we running with the average, or we're getting where we need to be at the end of the year? First year corn fungicides. This was one that as I looked at this, a couple things kind of jumped out at me as far as maybe, we've got a lot of new products up here. The Veltima, the Delaro Complete, those are kind of some newer fungicides. We've got the opportunity, wider application window, or being able to get out there with a ground rig at V10, V12. Before things start tasseling, I think we're getting a lot better coverage with a ground rig compared to the airplane. We're getting that product placed throughout the canopy, and some of that's showing up in the yield as as far as being able to get out there earlier and have a longer window on the residual or the protection than maybe some of those other products. Now, if we get into a situation where we are at that R1, R2 time frame, and before the plane gets out there, I would probably go with some of the older products and save that $5–10 an acre, because if we've already got some disease in there, we're just protecting what hasn't been infected yet, and I don't think it's translating yield quite as much as maybe getting some of these newer products on earlier. Corn on corn fungicide. Now, after last year, we didn't have a whole lot of corn on corn acres just because from the down corn and what have you, but the no fungicide on the acres that were corn on corn kind of surprised me this year compared to what we've seen in the past. And I do know that Delaro Complete, that was a one field deal, so you know, I'm not putting a whole lot of merit in that, but I wanted to include it because it was part of the data set. Tillage. We talked last year on the variability of tillage, and you know, maybe what wins out one year doesn't win out the next year, which is the case on most of it. But we've talked numerous times about the no-till. Maybe not winning, but it's more consistent. We don't have the high and low fluctuation of yields on a year-to-year basis that we do, but with some of the tillage. But this year, the conventional, and I was really surprised with the early planting and the real dry conditions. You know, we had a lot of areas or acres that, you know, that seed maybe sat in dry dirt for 2 weeks and didn't germinate quite as evenly as some of the other minimum tills or what have you, but didn't translate to the final yield numbers this year. Corn on corn there again, one pass versus two pass. It was kind of interesting that I tried splitting it out as far as the conventional two pass. That's one deep tillage pass in the fall followed by a shallow spring tillage, compared to a too shallow pass where maybe a guy ran out in the fall and hit it with a vertical till or a disc or something like that, and then came back in this spring with a finisher or field cultivator. I was kind of surprised that you know, maybe we don't have to do that deep tillage and get as much of that residue buried in a corn on corn situation as what we need to, and we'll continue to look at this. This was just something new that kind of stuck out at us this year. We'll continue to follow this the next few years and see what kind of trends continue on that. Cover crops. There again, this is first year corn, and this is 2021 yield data the last several years. Has paid to have a cover crop. This year was the first year that maybe the cover crop didn't pay, and there again, I was a little intrigued by the results, thinking that with having a cover crop out there, we would have maintained some extra soil moisture and had a little quicker germination, but it is what it is here. We're still still looking at about 7 bushel advantage to corn on having a cover crop out there over the last 4 or 5 years here. So, you know, I'm not ready to kick it out of bed yet, but it's definitely, if we're gonna do that, we've gotta manage some other things accordingly, rather than just putting a cover crop out there. And if you guys are interested, I mean, we can talk through some of that stuff later, but, any questions on any of the corn information before we jump into the beans? Okay. Soybean yields, there again, God's country just keeps, they continue to take that trophy home with them every year. Planting dates. This was very interesting this year. If we look at the acres, I mean, 50% of the soybean acres were planted by April 29th. So I don't know if that's indication that we just got out there and got the corn done that much quicker, if guys are getting that second planter and starting the bean planter the day after we start corn, or the same day we start planting corn, or what the situation is. But really got after the bean planting this past year. Before planting, first half versus second half, before that April 29th, there was a substantial yield increase compared to the corn, and I guess that's no surprise. And a lot of the articles that we're reading from the seed companies, from the universities, they're telling us, you know, get out there in that mid-April and get to planting the beans. We canopy quicker and capture a lot more of the sunlight and things like that when we're trying to do the grain fill. There again, just for you to reference each year, first half versus second half. And then an 8-year average, so you don't have to do the math. You know, we're still about that 6 bushel yield advantage. And the average is May 10th. So I guess, you know, if I'm sitting here thinking, trying to plan, I'm weather permitting, I'm going to have all my crop in by the 10th of May. That seems to be kind of the magic date before we really start sloughing off yield-wise on corn and soybeans. So, just to kind of give you an idea here, what guys are doing that are doing the variable rate planting. Based off row spacing, this was the average target population by management zone. And as I was going through putting these numbers together, it was kind of interesting. For all row spacings, on the A and B zones, we were about 10,000 seeds per acre less on average than what we were in 2020. C zones, we dropped a little bit. It was maybe in that 6,000 to 7,000 range. So we're keeping those populations up there a little higher than what we backed off compared to last year on the A and B zones. And then yield by management zone, pretty consistent. And what was really surprising was some of the averages that we were pulling off those tough acres here from this last year. Here's another slide like on the corn where we kind of tried to clean things up, and we gave you an average over the last 9 years in kind of the gold bar versus what this year's yield response by population ranges were. As we start looking at some of the lower populations, obviously we don't have as many years of data or acres of data that we have. You know, when I started, I think we were, you know, I got some guys to plant 125, 130,000 in an A-zone low check, and we were thinking, man, I hope this isn't a crop disaster. And since then, we've continued to just kind of back populations off. I'm not sure we've figured out exactly how low we can go on some of these A zones and the better producing areas, if it's properly drained, if it's, you know, if conditions are set, what have you. But to kind of maybe take a little deeper dive into some of this more recent lower population data, we looked at everything that was had a target rate of 115,000 or less, and this year we had just under 1,200 acres that was planted at those populations. So it's become more than just a few learning blocks at a, you know, 3/4 acre learning blocks at a 95,000 rate or whatever the number is. The other thing I wanted to look at was row spacings. You know, we've been to some deer meetings, some field things with deer. You know, you look at some of the university studies, and they're saying that low populations makes a difference on what the row spacing is. So based off of those row spacings, to me it looks somewhat inverse from what they've been saying, where the wider row spacings are handling those lower populations better than the narrow rows. And I don't know if it's because on the narrow road spacings we have more space in between the seeds, and we're not quite getting the same push from the next bean as we are in the wider rows. If there's just too much gap, we're not getting the emergence that we need on the narrower rows. The other thing to think about when we're talking starting some of these lower populations or moving towards these lower populations like this, Iowa State did that study here a couple of years ago looking at the ExactEmerge planter, and when they compared it with the competitors' high-speed planter, the ExactEmerge had a 9% greater emergence as far as final stand than the competition did. So if you guys are running that ExactEmerge planter with the precise spacing and precise seed depth that it offers, I think this is one more way that we can help keep a little more money in your pocket at the end of the year, is continue to chase some of these lower populations. Get into the some of their performance by the hybrids here again, and those are in the middle of your book as well. But representation of the companies from this last year. Again, top 20 with a minimum of 20 acres. Minimum 3 fields, 200 acres. And then the top 20 most popular. Soybeans and tillage. There again, I mean, kind of difficult to really do anything wrong, no matter what we did. But I think it does follow the trend of what we've seen the last 4 or 5 years. Fungicides, didn't have a whole lot of disease this last year. I didn't see maybe quite as much response as we've seen in the past, but there were some products that performed quite a bit better than some of the others. Cover crops, kind of the opposite of what we saw in the corn this year, more in line with what we've seen in the past. Still saw a decent yield response on the cover crops for soybean. 2 bushel average for the last 5 years. Any question on the soybean? Okay. Moving into the nutrient management, and you know, boy, this has made the headlines how many times, and made the 10 o'clock news. You know, everybody talking about input prices and how it's affecting things. I want to spend a little time looking at some of this, looking at some of the responses, some of the comparisons, and try and help you guys manage through some of this hopefully short-term pricing that we're experiencing right now. So this is first year corn. We did not include the corn on these, but just kind of gives you an idea of what we're seeing. We didn't break things down as far as fall versus spring. We've done some of that in the past, and the trend was kind of the same on that. But you can see here just a one pass of anhydrous compared to an anhydrous followed by liquid, anhydrous followed by a top dress urea or Amidus, whatever the product is. Compare that to your multiple trips of liquid, hog manure followed by a top dress, and the CMS product there that comes out of the Eddyville byproduct. And you know, depending, yes, it's a little bit weather dependent, but no matter whether we're talking a liquid nitrogen planting or top dressing dry in season, those multiple passes are still paying. Nitrogen rates. This was a real eye opener to me. You know, we've looked at it in the past here, and I don't remember it being quite as significant as what we're looking at this year. But this is the same. These are the same 2 groups of guys that we were looking at variable rate versus non-variable rate on the planting side of things. This is just looking at nitrogen. So the guys that did do variable rate on an A zone, we looked at about 193 pounds of total N per acre. 180 on the B zone and 170 on the C zone. Compare that with those guys that did not variable rate, and quite a significant difference. Convert that over to nitrogen efficiency, or pounds of N per bushel. If we look at the average yield for those groups of guys, and how efficient we were with the nitrogen. 0.93 pounds of N per bushel compared to 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, and you know, you think back 20 years ago, all the universities, everybody was telling us we needed somewhere between that 1.1, 1.2 pounds of N per bushel, and if that wasn't enough, we cranked the dial up on the bar just a little bit more to make sure that we got at least that on. Now we're to the point, we've done this long enough, they're saying it's about, they're using 0.8 pounds of nitrogen per bushel is kind of what the universities and others are saying we need. So as we look at this and we get in, you look at the benchmarking and things like that in the back of your book, we're getting real close to that. Some of these areas, you know, the C zones in particular, you know, I don't think we'll ever make the C zones as efficient as an A zone. I mean, we're either going to have to get those C zones to average, you know, get the average yield up from 140 to 200 bushel, or we're going to have to, if we're going to be as efficient on the nitrogen side of things, you know, all of a sudden we're only going to be able to put 80 pounds of nitrogen out there on a C zone, and those are typically the areas that are lower in the organic matter. There's some CEC issues that we're dealing with where we maybe can't hold as much nitrogen, but we've got to keep a higher pounds per bushel rate out there than I think we can get away with on some of the better ground, the higher producing ground, to get those bushels that we are getting out of there. So, well, what's this mean to a guy if you guys are in the process of getting your nitrogen plan put together for spring? You know, as we're looking at $1 a pound difference in nitrogen, you know, there again, I mean, we're somewhere between $65 and $75 an acre that we can put in your pocket just by writing a variable rate anhydrous prescription compared to going out and flat rating what we've done in the past. Kind of pulled this one out of the archives here from a few years ago. Just kind of wanted to refresh some of the numbers and show you what it can mean for your operation. These were two growers from 2017 through 2019, so a 3-year average nitrogen and what their nitrogen efficiency was. And you can see that we're within 4 bushel. That was about as close as we could come up with, was a 4 bushel yield difference between the two growers. But we were about 60 pounds of nitrogen different. And based off those differences in just the nitrogen rates alone, you know, we were $42 an acre difference. If you farm 500 acres, at the end of that 3-year average that the guy on top made put $63,000 in his pocket just by variable rating the nitrogen compared to flat rate. I think that covers your yield force enrollment. We might have a little bit left over to take mother out for supper at the end of the year. Jumping into the applied phosphorus, there again comparing variable rate versus non-variable rate, and not as significant a difference here, but It does prove that by us laying your grid samples with your yield maps and fertilizing for actual removals versus maybe using an assumed yield for removals, we are providing a benefit to you, especially when we get into some of those lower yielding areas. You know, if we're only pulling 140 bushel off, there's no reason to use an assumed 200 bushel per acre yield and fertilize for that on those tougher areas. Response to soil P, this is, you know, one of the things that we use in our equations as far as building two different soil test levels based off the zones. And we can validate that by going above and beyond, whether it's Iowa State or whoever, by building above their optimum levels on the A zones and B zones, we can increase yield compared to what Iowa State considers optimum. We don't want to sacrifice yield by not building to what the areas can potentially produce, but there's only, like I said before, there's only, we only need to build to this level on some of the tougher areas. Let's reposition that extra product over to where we're consistently paying the bills in those certain areas of the fields every year. Applied potassium, kind of the same way here. And then soil test K. The one thing that we have seen throughout the years, and Dan Freeberg, that owns Premier Crop, had seen even before we started with the company, was an increased nitrogen efficiency based off of soil test K. So if we have two areas of the field that are exact same soil types, exact what have you, drainage, if one area has a soil test value K of, let's just say 230 parts per million versus an area over here that has a soil test value of 160 or 70, both those areas would be considered at least an optimum level from Iowa State. But when we start looking at nitrogen efficiency, we can produce a lot more bushels off the same amount of nitrogen if our soil test K is 50 to 60 parts per million higher than this area over here. So it's one thing to keep in mind that once we get our soil test values where we want them to be, then we can really start playing with our nitrogen recommendations and tweaking them and seeing how efficient we can really get. That might explain some of the difference in your books there as you guys are looking down through the nitrogen efficiency rankings. Soil test sulfur. I had a lot of questions on this year, and I don't know what made it resurface, but I thought it was worthwhile digging into it and kind of maybe touching on this again. I was thinking back to my previous life when I was an agronomist at co-op. Iowa State had done some studies, and based off what their research was showing us, my recommendation back then was, yes, we need to put sulfur on, and the $64,000 question was how much, and at that time we saw a consistent yield response to 20 pounds of sulfur applied. When we looked at, and if I think they were looking at maybe 20 pounds versus 40 pounds versus 80, something like that. As we got to that 40 pounds of sulfur range, it was, it became, well, do you want to use my coin or yours to figure out whether we put 20 or 40 on, you know, whether the extra 20 pounds paid. 2021, there was a significant difference between 20 and 40 pounds. So, as you read some of these articles, they're talking about easy rule of thumb is 1 pound of sulfur for every 10 pounds total nitrogen. You know, so that kind of goes back, and you know, if we look at the numbers, 20 pounds is pretty safe to say we're going to consistently see that yield response to sulfur. Above that, yeah, maybe not. The other thing I wanted to touch on the sulfur is when we're looking at applying sulfur, we need to look at the timing, the amount of water that's in the soil, and the type of product that we're looking at applying. There's basically two types of sulfur. There's elemental and there's sulfate. Elemental, just like anhydrous, the elemental sulfur is not plant available. It has to go through a conversion to become plant available. The sulfate sulfur is plant available, and there again, kind of like nitrogen, the sulfate sulfur is available to move within, if it's plant available, it's available to move within that soil profile. So as we're looking, you know, if we're looking at spreading dry in the fall with our P&K, if we're spreading the sulfate sulfur, we're just kind of exposing ourselves that much more to losing that sulfur before the crop needs it. Any questions on that? It's kind of a high level, but I only took the science classes that were required to graduate, so I can't explain it a whole lot better than that. No questions, we'll keep moving forward here.
I have plenty of pictures of side-by-side sulfur versus no sulfur on Finder.
Okay.
And it's night and day just visually looking at it and then looking at it off the season.
So we can kind of, if you've got some questions, we can go over that after the meeting, whatever. But moving ahead here, soil apply or response to P&K on the soybean. Kind of the same thing we've seen over the last several years. And there again, yield response to soil test P. Maybe not quite as trend line as what we've seen in the past, but we are still seeing a response to having those rates where the levels where they need to be. Like potassium there again, just make sure we're managing things by zone where they need to be. So, what's all this information mean to you guys? And I think this next slide, hopefully Katie's paying attention, and it'll earn me the gold star for the day. But everything agronomic is economic. That's something Dan's been on here for the last couple of years. If you look at this information, we went back and we pulled the average yields of variable rate planted versus straight rate planted. And we compared the seed, the average target population of variable rate versus not variable rated, nitrogen, P&K. And I went through here and we highlighted where each product or each application lost us money. So if you remember back to that first couple slides there where we had the A zone on variable rate planted, we were actually 2 bushel less. So, I mean, we were $10 short using $5 corn. Now, that was only last week, but how outdated I am already. B zone, we made a little more money, and then we lost a little more money on the C zone as well. Seed, we just used an average of $230 a bag. I'm not saying it's exact, but I don't think it's far enough off that anybody can argue that. Nitrogen, I did use $1,400 a ton ammonia. I know a lot of you, if you got it put on last fall, you know, we were still in that 7.5, whatever, but if we're looking at getting our nitrogen plans ready to go here, just, I mean, these are true numbers and how it can affect your bottom line. Phosphorus and potassium, same way. The numbers down there at the bottom, the 269,000 versus 242. On those A, B, and C zones, a couple of years ago here, when we started working on the on our harvest lab for the manure sense, I went back into our data and figured out how many acres the A zone represented versus the B zone versus the C zone. 43% of the acres were an A zone, 38% was a B zone, and 19% was a C zone. So what I did was I took that yield return, the 1,035, subtracted all the management costs out of there, and we ended up with $626 an acre profit before cash rents, before your crop insurance, things like that. Based off of those percentages, comparing 1,000 acre, if it was 1,000 acre corn grower, we put an extra $76.25 per acre in your pocket versus the acres that were not variable rate planted, variable rate ammonia, whatever the situation was. And I don't think there's anybody in here that wouldn't take an extra $76,000 at the end of the year compared to the neighbor. So if you have questions on some of this stuff, how do we get started doing a variable rate nitrogen application or whatever it is, if you're not doing it, ask us after the meeting. There's tons of different ways we can start to look at this stuff. The last thing I want to point out is your grower top 10 reports. The guys that I work with, every one of them, they get a book at the end of the year, and I use this kind of as, this is our report card per field, per grower entity, whatever you want to look at. But correlation to dry yield, I try and look at every field that we've got, and figure out how did we do, and what this report drives from. And I'm going to skip ahead here. Most of you have seen it, and most of you understand, but whether it's soil test attributes, whether it's applied nutrients, planting population, all these reports, the very top line is the bottom 10%, and then it's 2020, 2020, and the top 10%. And then the program starts to sort things out here, And if you think of a true correlation as a 1-to-1, so every time we increase this by 1, we see an increase in the result as 1. So increase in 1 pound of nitrogen, we gain 1 bushel. That would be a true 1-to-1 correlation. Obviously, it's going to vary. I mean, we can't say 1 seed versus 1 bushel. It's the same as 1 pound versus 1 bushel. But what I do look at here is the things that we're doing are having a higher influence on yield than some of the things that we can't control. You know, when we look at soil type, we can't change that. We can't change organic matter. We can change organic matter, but it's going to be a long time. But the things that we can control, soil test K, total K rate, phosphorus soil test, total applied P, those things that we can control are having a higher influence on the final yield than some of the things that are out of our hand. So if you haven't looked at these, I strongly suggest to take a look and kind of use this. Maybe, you know, maybe it'll raise some questions. You know, what's going on here? What can we do that's going to change the end result the quickest? And then what's the next thing that we need to look at? Things like that. Any questions on anything I went over? If not, I'll turn it over to Ethan and let him cover the benchmarking.
And first, just wanted to do a little bit of general housekeeping stuff with the booklets. So, if you are one of our current customers, you'll have a sticker with your name on it, because here in the back, where I'm going to now, you'll have your own data in there for your own fields. If you don't, you know, if you're not a current customer, it will just say ABC Farms, and it's just kind of a made-up stuff, which is what you see up here. It's actual numbers, but made-up information as far as names and all that go. But in the books, I've noticed, seems like everybody seems to know that all the slides are here at the front of the book, following along. But right now, on the page, the big benchmarking picture on it, like you see up on the screen. You can see we've only got 1, 2, 3, 6. We've only got 10 slides left. But then there's more in the book. So there's a big, heavier paper divider, which Brett already mentioned. Those are the big hybrid variety lists, full pages. So there's 6 pages there, 3 corn, 3 beans, full pages. Then there's another big divider, heavy paper, and it says benchmarking results. You get past that page, so what I would call the very back of the book, then the pages turn sideways, and you'll see what we'll get into here in just a bit. So if you want to see these pages closer up, because the slide will probably be hard to read, and then the slide version of your book will be hard to read because it's so small. The full pages are here at the very back, after the benchmarking title page with the tractor side dressing corn. So feel free to flip back and forth if you want, take notes anywhere, and ask any questions. Please ask questions. That's what we're here for. Makes things go easier, and just I like to get challenged every once in a while. So with benchmarking, sorry, I'm Ethan. If anyone didn't know who I am, I've been with Sinclair and Yieldforce for 6 years now, and this is exactly what I love to do: ag and data and technology, all for the more. So for our yield nitrogen benchmarking, it's been mentioned a little bit already, but basically we take the yield data from all the fields, all the customers, take nitrogen information, all that stuff, take the field info, so taking
CSR, if the fields are in Iowa, if they're not in Iowa, we take those other states' productivity indexes and turn them into what would be a CSR number to compare everything. Then we're able to compare poorer fields to better fields, average fields to better fields, and so on and so forth. All customers have their own data, like I said, in their own packet. Otherwise, there's just the generic one here, which is what I'll show up on the screen. So first is just kind of a background of how we get to this benchmarking data. I actually have a bunch of years hidden. This data set that we have goes back to 2012. So I could have a whole bunch more lines on the screen, but it just makes it more confusing. So I've hidden everything up until 2017. So you can see just how the yields are. So this is corn yields going up, and this is CSR increasing. So this would be a really, really good field. What would its average yield have been for the group on a given year? Versus a really poor field, you know, something hilly in the timber with clay, you know, its yields are more down here. So if you're looking at renting a new field, buying a new field, something like that, I always like to reference these slides because it sort of gives you a, you know, if you've got a field that's about, you know, midway CSR range, what has it done in my area lately? Well, you know, it's done basically from 160 to 200 every year. So that's where this is coming from. This is also then what we use as sort of the benchmark. So 21 last year is in blue. So that's last year's line right there. So given a CSR, if we have an 85 CSR field, that should have done, quote unquote should have done, you know, about 215, we'll say. Whatever that number is, the math comes out exact somewhere. Versus last year, if you had a quarter field, that should have yielded, you know, somewhere in probably that 170 range. So then what we'll get into is the actual fields and how they did compare to that line. Here's the same chart but for soybeans. So the same number of years. You can see, you know, poorer ground yields less than better ground. There's actually usually a bigger spread in yield depending on the year. So there's more variance in our yields down here than there is on these really good soils. And like Brett said earlier, our gains in soybeans were really on this poorer end this past year. The better stuff kind of came back to the rest of the group up here. So this is where you can't read this, which you probably can't because I can hardly read it, and my glasses on and I'm standing closest to it. This is where it's going to flip all the way to the back of the book. It'll be that first sideways page after the benchmarking with the tractor picture. So it'll look like this in your book, sideways landscape. And this is where we show our customers where they yielded versus the group as a whole. So there's three main columns. First column is first year corn. Middle column, corn on corn. The colors aren't showing up as well here, but they're colored in your book there. And then soybeans over there. So if a customer had first year corn, corn on corn, and soybeans, like this example, their name would show up in each of these spots wherever it fell. Really the thing to look at is that first column, average yield. So that's the average yield for that entire grower, or at least the fields that they're allowing us to look at. So that's the yield for that grower as a whole. Then a weighted average. So it's a weighted average yield, a weighted average CSR for all our fields. Expected yield, that's that EY. So that's what we would expect that grower to do yield-wise, given that line that we have for this year's data. The PY is in blue for each of these, and then it's the colored numbers, green or red, going down. That's the performance yield compared to what we expected. So if we expect a field to do 200 for corn, but it actually did 220, that performance yield would be a positive 20. It'd be green and it would be 20, so they'd be up here somewhere because they did 20 bushels better than what they quote unquote should have given the year in all of our data. So basically about half of the growers are above zero and about half of the growers are below zero as far as where did you fall with last year's data, last year's fields. So this is sort of we're using the real data, real information. This is the opposite of like coffee shop talk, where people just make up yields. Usually they're extra high. That field did 275. It always does 275. In reality, we're more in here. So I guess, does anybody have any questions on how this table works or how you read it? There's a lot of time and numbers and effort that goes into making this, and then it looks fairly simple, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the background to get to it. So once we've got this information, the next thing we share is just corn. So this is all cornfields in the group. They're all every dot up here is a field. Fall is where its CSR is, and then what I got for yield. We include the line, so this would have been the blue line on the earlier graph. That's 2021's average yield if you put a regression line through it. So what we're measuring is how far above or below. So if you take one of these red dots up here, these two fields did better than they should have. So that would be a positive number, and it's just how far the distance is in bushels. So these would all be above, this would be below. These red dots would be just slightly below the average given last year's fields. So that's corn, and the red dots are first corn. There is a corn on corn, which these colors aren't showing up here very well. It's right there, it's kind of a square, it's usually orange. So if you have orange squares, corn on corn, they would be there as well. So you can pick out, notice where some growers, their first corn is usually above the line, and their corn on corn might be below the line, where it's falling a little bit behind the first year corn that's after beans usually. Soybean yield is the next page, the next full page there. So if you had soybeans, your name would be up here, and your fields would be highlighted. Otherwise, this is just an engineering point again. So every field is a dot, given its yield and CSR, and then we're measuring how far above or below that line to give it a performance yield. So then we're trying to learn and figure out, like these two fields up here in red did very well compared to what they could or should have done. What did we do different in those two fields last year? Was it different tillage? Was it different seed? Was it a fungicide? So this is an easy way to look and see what did we do here and start digging into the differences. Granted, this group of four is a much lower CSR, much poorer soils than these, but we still actually have 3 fields above the line. So maybe comparing those 3 fields to this one, basically the same CSR, what happened here that we didn't do in those other 3, that might explain that difference. Because we want to try to get this one above the line for next year. The next page is just all those fields for that customer. So for you, your name would be here, your farm and field names would be here, your yield would be here. So this is basically the same information, and then this is broken down by field over here. So like I said, on the bean graph, they were all above the line except for one. You look at soybeans down here, they're all green, and here's where you get the exact number that they're above or below. And then you can see there's one that's in red. So that one field was 6.2 bushels below the group average for last year. Whereas some of these were 10 and 20 over what that CSR could have or should have produced. So this is sort of the real world report card on how did my fields do compared to the group, given the same, rainfall that's the yield benchmarking. Any questions on the yield side? Hunter, you didn't have a question? Okay. So then we do the same thing with nitrogen, like Brett mentioned before. We have 3-year averages too. I don't think I included them in here. But this is nitrogen benchmarking, so pounds of N applied compared to yield. Again, for the whole grower, so your name would show up in here if you had first year corn, your name would show up over here if you have corn, and where it falls. And then they're sorted by this pounds of N per bushel, like Brett mentioned before. So the most efficient growers being at the top, they're getting the most corn out of their pounds of N versus the ones down here that are putting out more N and maybe not necessarily getting as much back. Not to say it's good or bad, but it's just a way to compare anonymously to everyone else. And then I think this is the last slide I've got. So this is our profit force. It's a full Excel sheet that we've got. Everything's pre-built. All we put in is input prices, insurance prices, all that kind of stuff. I didn't even put it up here because, like Brett said, prices have changed so much lately that anything I put up would be wrong. So I just wanted to make it known that we have it available. We can share it with you guys. We can send it to you. We can help fill it out with you. But it goes through, different break-even prices, different rents and yields. If my yield goes to this, what does everything else fall out to? But you can include everything from trucking, custom, harvest rates, all that stuff, to seed price. What are we selling at for grain prices? So normally we would include a lot of that in the book, but like I said, as soon as we print it, it would be $200 off. So we'll leave it out for now, but we have that as sort of just a living document that we can update at any time or send to anyone if they want to fill it up. So that's all I've got as far as benchmarking goes. No one has any questions? No questions, Lane? Come on. Really? Okay. Last time I got in trouble because every machine was green, so that is a red combine in the picture there. I didn't put it on the last slide, but it is in here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Katie.
Guess what I stand between you and lunch? Oh, look at that. Oh, I got some laughter. That's good. So, for some reason, Brent seemed to think that if I talked after lunch, you were going to fall asleep. And I'm like, they've obviously not. Pipers are laughing at me in the back. They're like, we've heard Katie at presentations before. So, hopefully, I'm going to keep you awake until lunch and keep it pretty brief. But just an introductory of who I am and why I'm here today is what I'm going to cover first, and then we'll get into why yield force matters and how they can help you navigate through the waters. So, as Brent had done earlier, he had said that my name is Katie. I always put my maiden name in parentheses because I am local, Lewis McWhirter. Here's a picture of my kids. I am a Southeast Iowa farm kid who grew up, I think it took me less than 15 minutes to get here today. So just outside of Washington, I left, went to school at Iowa State, graduated there. I came back and served as a high school ag and FFA instructor in Columbus Junction. Grew up in the 80s. How many of you were farming in the 80s? Oh, good. This is going to be interactive, okay? So at that time, my mom and dad basically was like, don't farm, don't marry a farmer, right? Like 80s were not great times, but I knew that agriculture was my passion. So I did the next best thing, and that was go off and get a degree so I could teach others about the importance of agriculture. So did that. While I was doing that, you can tell I'm high energy and I don't sit still well, okay? I was working part-time in ag retail, crop scouting, doing some other things, and when I couldn't stand the public school system any longer, I reached out and took a job in ag retail and started up their precision offering and actually using Premier Crop as our software in order to help growers like yourselves make sense of data and manage variability. So I spent, it's negotiable of how many years, part-time, full-time, and in transition in ag retail, and then because these two crazy kids and 90-hour weeks, that wasn't really the lifestyle I needed to live. I was going back to education at the community college level, and Premier Crop reached out, said, hold the show. You used our software and you're an educator. So in 2017, I took a job with Premier Crop Systems to become their head of training and development of people, not software. I am not a software developer. And so that was awesome. Every other week when I didn't have my kids, I'm out training, coaching anywhere from Saskatchewan to Oklahoma, from Montana to the Ukraine. So I can tell you this morning as my kids are watching the morning news, and my 10-year-old, as I'm getting breakfast ready, says, well, Mom, the Russians did it. I said, what? I'm like, I'm frying bacon, like the exhaust fan's on, I can't hear, we're yelling. He's like, the Russians invaded. I'm like, oh my gosh, right? So taking some phone calls, some video shots, as friends of mine are fleeing the country, trying to figure out how to get out. And here I am worried about state wrestling this weekend. Put that in perspective, right? So anyway, was training, coaching, and COVID shut me down. So training and coaching went virtual, and again, I don't sit still well, and I need a challenge. I said, I want to start to develop business in eastern Iowa and work more closely with some of our partners. So in June, Yield Force got me as their retail account lead. So helping them to help you derive value from your data is what I do. So that's a little bit about me. And I said that's the church directory picture. This is most often what it looks like around my house. My 10-year-old son, William, is sitting there picking on his sister. It's a madhouse. So that's a little bit about me. I mentioned Premier Crop Systems. I don't know if any of you know, but that is the software behind the analytics that Yield Force uses with your data. And I take that for granted that you know that, but you should know that and know that your data, where it's going, and who actually sees it, because that's an important thing. Okay, so Premier Crop Systems, our national headquarters is located in Des Moines, Iowa. And I did a training in January in the office, and the people that were there that showed up, they're like, that's not what we expected. So our national headquarters is a little brick building that sits west, just south of the airport. In Des Moines, and until COVID shut us down, we didn't even have a sign on the outside of our building. We had a little decal on the door. Like we're pretty small, and nobody even goes to the office anymore because COVID sent us all to work remotely, other than having some meetings and trainings in that facility. But that makes sense because we're focused on helping growers, and growers aren't showing up in brick buildings in Des Moines. Growers are out here. So we're very much about the customer. So a little more background. Premier Crop was founded in 1999. Our founder, Brett referenced Dan Freeberg. Dan's actually from Fairfield. His family's still around that area, but managed an ag retail location there. Had done some lobbying, and had a consulting business, and realized in the 90s when the yield monitor came out that there was variability within the field, and these maps were showing us that, and there had to be more to it. What's correlating to yield? What's driving yield? And more importantly, there's got to be some economic impacts behind that. And Brett mentioned that Dan nearly bankrupted the company right out of the gate in the 90s because he wanted to drive everybody to entering costing with all this variability. So he had to back off. But now more than ever, this is important. So we are a privately owned business. We have our own developers and software people, which is a great thing because we can be really laser focused. But it's also kind of a disadvantage because we have our own developers and it's a small group of people. Our company, I think, total people combined is 45 people. So So privately owned, we don't buy data, we don't sell data, we don't sell inputs. Okay, we're strictly about software development and keeping your data safe and confidential. So always been a web-based platform, and we will continue to develop and innovate on that web-based platform to enable advisors and growers to learn how and where managing field variability matters the most in the drive to yield efficiency. And I'm going to get to that here in a minute. Our vision is to help growers and their trusted advisors like Wade, Brent, Brett, Ethan, to use your data to produce higher yields, higher profits. And as we're finding out, as we're doing that, we're being more environmentally responsible. And Brett alluded to that with nitrogen efficiency. I came back from the AAI conference 2 weeks ago. Nitrogen is on the radar. It is definitely on the radar. Iowa State is back using NREC. They're actually using Premier Crop to do the analytics, because when government's going to make that call, who do you think they're going to call on to make that recommendation? It's the universities. So they're using us. Last year, my dad actually had one in his field, but we had trials out throughout the state, and they're doing that again this year. It's really interesting, the analytics that we're getting back from that. Our mission is to analyze, advise, and act on the results of multiple levels to multiple stakeholders. So all this data is nice, but it's what you do with it that matters. We want to generate best-in-class recommendations using both art and science. I like to say we're at the great crosshairs of economics, agronomics, and technology. And we want to enable growers and their trusted advisors to benchmark across equivalent agronomic environments to accelerate learning. So that's a little bit about Premier Crop. Any questions yet? Because now you're about to get engaged. Okay, good. So let's talk about 2021 versus 2022. This is where you get to speak up, because the faster you respond, the closer that's when you're going to get food in your tummies. Okay? So 1034.0. Let's think back to 2021 crop year. Give me a ballpark. What did you spend on it if you used 1034.0? You don't want food. Okay, I'm going to throw out numbers because I do work direct with some growers, so I get to look at invoices. So I'm going to use $500 as the number per ton. The invoice I looked at 2 weeks ago showed $1,000 a ton for 1034.0. Anybody want to give me a price of 32% a year ago?
80 cents a pound.
Okay. 220 is finding one of the retailers in Washington that I deal with. It was 222. Luckily, across all the growers that I worked with, it was the same price. 220, I rounded down. This year, 600 was the one of my last grower last week when I grabbed his prepay. Matt? Oh, fall of 2020 was great, wasn't it? $300. I had one grower at 285. This past year, 800. This past fall. Potash. Ooh, here we go. Anhydrous. Took 450. You can play with these numbers however. You know where I'm going with this. That was fall price. Fall this year, if you could get it, $775 is going to be pretty good. You look at spring, this past spring, $650. One of my growers did spring anhydrous. I called one of my partner in southern Minnesota yesterday. I said, hey, give me your price today for anhydrous. Anybody want to take a guess? And this is southern Minnesota, not southeast Iowa. So price of anhydrous today for spring anhydrous.
Didn't give you one.
Oh, they didn't give you one. That's funny because I was like, do you even have one, right? What is it?
13.
Ooh, $15.30. That's what she told me. I go, oh, that's higher than what they told me at AI 2 weeks ago. Great. Seed cost in 2021. I just put a dollar amount because I'm not going to go there. There's too much variability there. But compared to now, probably up 5 to 10%. pending crop protection. That has been fun. As I'm helping my growers plan out, because they prepaid this stuff, they know what they're going to put out in rates. Man, oh man, AMS, volunteer, Roundup. So I just ballparked it and said it's up 25%. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, right? So my question to you all is, how do you navigate these waters? Sell high. We all laugh. What's everybody else thinking? Drown in the flood. I love it. No one says this though. This is what I typically get. I gotta cut back. I gotta cut. I'm in panic mode, right? I gotta cut. And my question to that and to my growers who I deal with direct with is where? More specifically, which field? Where in the field? Where in the field? Because cutting costs without cutting profitability is essential. And there is a fundamental difference. I think oftentimes we're like, I gotta cut. Well, I think what you really mean is, I gotta be more profitable. And if you don't know where to cut, and you're cutting where it can return you most, that's not doing you any sort of good. So in the next 15 minutes, I promise, I just want to get through how to help you navigate the waters, and YieldForce can help you to do that. Some of you have seen some of the new features and pieces of the Premier Crop with and YieldForce can help to offer you to help you navigate these waters. Some of you haven't. So I'm going to pretend like none of you have. Okay? So first and foremost, use your data. Brett did a great job. He showed you your grower report card. If you're in YieldForce, you have a report card. You have a trusted advisor. My goodness, he showed you in that book, that field top 10 report and correlations. How many of you know about how to read a field top 10 report and correlations? Oh, good. That's great. Use your advisors. That's what they're here for. Use your data. I like this. We launched our yield efficiency score. I'll get to this in just a minute. It's kind of hard to see. So much coffee shop talk, as Ethan had said, is about yield, right? It's all about yield. Oh, I saw 330 on that monitor. I saw 350. I like the one I'm like, yeah, you slammed on the brakes with the combine and all the grain hit. That's good. You got that one data point. Good. However, it's been that metric of success, right? Yield, yield, yield. YieldForce with Premier Crops Help has launched yield efficiency score, and what that is yield times the benchmark selling price. Take out nutrients, take out chem, take out seed, take out operations. What's left over with that is the dollars returned to land and management. And the reason we pulled that out is it helps us to be able to benchmark not only at a group level, but also within your operations. Okay? So with that, go back. I don't know why I didn't zoom in. Sorry. Using your data, putting them all up against each other. We can see on this one, I know it's really hard to see back here, sorry. But we can rank fields within your own operation. And so on this, you can see that within this grower's operation, all of their, well, this is actually one of yours. I don't know if they're actually sitting in here. But we put all their corn and cornfields together. We set the benchmark selling price at 510. Silly me, right? Within this grower's operation, yields were 188 to 233. In this specific field we were looking at is 230 and a half for yield last year. Looks pretty good, right? When we start looking at the dollars returned to land and management for this field, within their operation was $600 to $750 and this field's sitting at 657. So what I'm saying is, there was $100 more that some other field returned them to land and management. Those are real dollars for this grower. And they can help you with this as well. So let's start looking at all your fields. Let's stack them up, and this is now this grower's fields. Pulled out just the corn fields for this. Ranked them by yield efficiency. Here's that field, 750, 600. Ranked by yield efficiency. The field in particular that we're looking at is this one in blue. Let's add the yield to it. That orange line is yield. So the most profitable field was not the highest yielding. Coworker of mine out of West Branch works with a pretty large grower. Their second most profitable field, and we're talking about they've got 60 fields, was their least profitable. The second highest yielding, least profitable. Taking that information and digging into it. Analyze your data. Sit down with your advisor. When I talk about time, how many of you actually tied your costs to your data this year? Okay. I challenge you to do so in 2022 because it matters. You've heard them talk about management zones. Well, how do we even know if they pay? We don't know if they pay unless you start tying costs to it. I love to use this story about we think we know about the profitability within our field. So some of you know my father. We can all smile and Carol, that's great. Smile and laugh. My dad called me. I was driving in 2020 in an ice storm. I had a 9-hour drive, and he's calling me, and he's like, "Okay," he's like, I lost my ass in the field. Sorry if I offended anybody. Lost my ass in the field north of our house. And he goes over the terraces. I'm like, "Oh, you did?" He's like, "Yep." I go, "Well, how much, Dad?" He goes, "Well, you know, I know." I said, "Oh, you know? Okay, I should know." Right there, well, I had a 9-hour drive. The guy was only going to talk for 4.5 of those. So I said, "Okay." And he's like, "Well, I know what my cost was on the field, and I know what my yield was, so I know." I said, "Dad, you variable rate your P, you variable rate your K, you variable rate your C's, and your yield map is still variable. So do you really know?" And I'm not kidding you. Those of you who know my father, you know what he said. He paused, and he says, "You're right." So when COVID sent me into lockdown with 2 children, we went over and piled through filing cabinets to tie all these costs to it. And when it was all said and done, and at that time, these C zones of my dad's, it was costing him $5.30 to $64 to produce a bushel of corn. That was 2019, not at today's prices. Like 2019, I was like, "Yep, Dad, you lost your ass." But now what do you do with it? That's the important part. So as I say about analyzing, if you're flat rating, this is a good example. I know it's hard to see in the back, I apologize. But we can see in our A zones here for this field, 251, the B zone was 237, the C zone was 200. Nutrient cost was about the same because they flat rated, kind of similar to what Brett was talking about. Seed cost was roughly the same. Chemical cost, field operations, land costs, those are all flat applications. Total gets wrapped up here, and it's hard to see back there, but most of us are concerned about this dollars per acre. So it was roughly the 770 to 788, a little bit of variance here based off the as applied file. But when we look at this cost per bushel, this should be able to show, there's a 71-cent per bushel difference in the A zone versus the C zone. What's that mean with $5.10 corn? Why did I do that, right? What's that mean? If If we talk about that in dollars returned to land and management, that C zone's gonna return us $511. That A zone's 762. If you're not managing fields and analyzing at a subfield level, like what Yield Force can help you with, do you know what you could be missing out on? And then taking that to say, how can I increase this number? Act on it. Data is like paint. It is useless unless it's applied. You can sit here, I know exactly. Like, you can sit here and look at all these numbers and be like, all right, well, let's go plant corn. Like, use your data. What business doesn't? I used to use this before he was elected, and then he had to get elected, and people hated some people did. But tell me, did Donald Trump ever, or does he ever take a pretty map, look at it, go, that's really cool, 3-hole punch it, stick it in a white 3-ring notebook, and put it on his shelf? I used to use Bill Gates, and then people hated him because he's the largest landowner. So I don't know, Warren Buffett, I don't care. What business person doesn't use their data to make actionable decisions? And then evaluates it. You are business people navigating really uncertain times. Use your group data. You've got plenty of it in here. The same thing can hold true within this group with the economics. And there were very few growers within the Yield Force group that did tie cost to everything, so I did group them all together. It's kind of fun. I don't know if any of these people are sitting in here today. But this is great. This grower was the highest yielding within the group and also returned the most amount of dollars to land and management. So doing pretty well. That's great, but I think we all want to do better. If I'm the best, I want to be even better. So I dug in further. I'm like, oh, there's my zoom in for them. So that they were the top of the group. Same with yield efficiency. Then I start pulling it at these different levels, seed, chem, for operations. Are there areas within the group that they are lacking that maybe we could take a deeper dive into to see how they could do better? And immediately you're like, ooh, that's red. Red is bad. The public school system, right? So immediately I can see on this one, I'm like, oh, they're on the high end. Not only for cost per acre, but seed cost per bushel in seed. That was their soybean fields, this is their corn field, and this is seed, by the way, and I can immediately see it again. So for me, I'm going to have to ask if this grower's in here, because I'd love to dive into this with them. So I'm like, wow, their seed cost in the group is quite a bit higher. I did dig in, and I started to realize that the seed company that they planted, predominantly 2 companies, when I started looking at the yield efficiency by seed company, here you go. So the company that they planted the majority of their acres on, the yield efficiency of the 3 was definitely the lowest. And I had to chuckle because I was comparing these 2 companies with their yield and yield efficiency numbers. And they're the 2 companies that continue to pop up in 3 of my growers that I work with. Not the highest yielding, but definitely the highest profit returning to land and management. So, use your data. And use the group data confidently. They've alluded to it. You've seen a lot of variation with it in these slides and whatnot. Think about the people in the room and how big this group data set is. Okay? Agronomy is local. We're sitting in Southeast Iowa. Yield Force can set up groups of like groups for you. Is it Washington County? Is it between 2 different roads? Is it not only Washington County, but also fields that get manure? Let's start using like groups. And also know that Yield Force's data is clean. So that should give you the confidence to look into group data. Plan for success in 2022. Brett alluded to it earlier about if you're talking about your in-season nitrogen plan. I say, how many of you confidently place for 2022? Show of hands. Good. Some of you weren't proud to say you have a plan in place. That's okay. If you don't, I'd say to start talking to Yield Force about what that could look like. Set field level yield goals. I'm guessing you guys in here have a lot of yield history. I met with one of my growers up by Williamsburg this past fall, and I'm like, what's our yield goals for your fields next year? 245. I'm like, on all of them? Yep. Okay. We got together a few weeks ago, and I'm like, all right, we're going to start building out your plan here. And I said, yield goal still 245. He's like, ooh, let's be really real. I'm like, yeah, let's be really real about what these yield goals look like. Okay? So be realistic. Use your data. Because I'm guessing not all your fields are going to be the same. Not all your soybean fields are going to be the same. I'm sure you've got that one field that's like, man, it is my top one every year. Right? Maybe even set subfield yield goals. And the reason why, go back to the yield efficiency. If you start to set realistic yield goals for 2022 on your fields, you can start to plug and play. So what if corn, what if I sell corn at $5.75? $7. What if it falls out? What's then my projected revenue at a field level? This is why my grower got over, he's like, I better be realistic on this. I'm like, right, now we're talking about projected revenue. Okay, so that's that income part of it, the really nice part. But then we got to take out those costs, remember? You've got fertilizer already on the ground, you know what's been applied. If you've prepaid for fertilizer, you know what you're putting on. Right? So you know your nutrient costs, so we can take that out of that projected revenue. Darn it, we're whittling away at those dollars. Probably many of you have prepaid for your chemicals, and you know what your chemical applications are going to be about. Now, they may vary. We'll adjust as we go through the season. But let's take that money out. Let's take out your seed costs. You know that you're going to have to use equipment in the field to do these things, so let's start taking out your operations costs. And all of a sudden, you can start to figure out what your yield efficiency is, not only by the different crops, and it's really hard to see, but at a field level. Start to identify fields that are going to be profit robbers before everything's put on the ground for the season. Start looking at your fields like this. Your average return to land management on all your corn fields is $500, and you can identify this field is already projected to return you $251 less than the average of your fields. Are there things you can do already to change that number? I liken it to this. You can ask me if I have a budget for my house, and I'll tell you I do. And Carly says, Katie, I need you to carve out an extra $500 out of your budget. All of a sudden, I'm like, ooh, I do not know. Man, I don't want to itemize sometimes because I'd hate to see what Amazon gets a month from me. But what I'm telling you is, you think you know your budget, you think you know your numbers, but until you get it all spelled out, all of a sudden it gets really real. And now I can do something. And the last thing I tell you is, and Brett alluded to it too, about nitrogen and other trials. Ethan talked about sulfur. Guys, this is $7 corn and you know what's coming at you. Use this product, use that product, 7 bushel, 3 bushel, right? Roll it all up, you guys should be, using all these products, get 550 bushel corn. Okay? Do they pay? I love this. My grower called me and goes, Katie, what do you know about Pivot Bio? He goes, had salesperson stop by. I said, Ben, I go, where do they tell you it performs best at? I don't know. I'm like, well, you have really high organic matter soils. So let's talk about where they think you're gonna see the best response, and let's stick a trial out there. Because these products probably do have some sort of performance in their data, right? They're showing a positive response. But where they're showing that positive response are those on fields similar to yours. So let's stick a trial out. Seeding rates, nitrogen or fertilizer, fungicides, biologicals, insecticides, foliars. I added this one because I had a grower last year. It was a technology upgrade. Once you add all this stuff onto planters and whatnot, does it pay or does it not? Set those up. Perfect with Brett in my lead, and I love this. Some of you have seen the learning blocks if you've been in Yield Force before. A learning block is simply a little check that to say, what if we push population, backed it off within that planting prescription or fertilizer prescription, nitrogen prescription? Love this one. This was one of my growers. We dropped to 91,000 seeds in soybeans versus the rest of the area around it. We planted at 108,500. Picked up an additional 7.5 bushels based off of the price he paid for seed and what the estimated selling price was. That dropping down in that 1.1 acres got him $104 more per acre. We would love to have another $104 per acre. We tested the other side of it and actually pushed population up to 135. We picked up an additional 0.2 of a bushel, so basically nothing, but because of the added seed cost, lost $5. His field, his data. We can stick in for rapid accelerated learning, enhanced learning blocks. They are a 3 to 5 rate trial or on off, put into any prescription to be able to analyze. This just happens to be one of my growers. It was done on corn, 3 different populations, 29, 32, and 35,000. The winning rate was 231, but it's not just looking at it by yield, because now we can aggregate that data and say, okay, I knocked out the hybrid, by the way, so don't try to read it, but with this hybrid, with these applied nutrients, with this soil, this is our rate, and we see this across other parts of our fields. Where should I be sticking this? Sticking that rate at? I'm going to plant this hybrid again. This is my grower from up north. It's the dad, I love Maurice. We're throwing insecticide, fungicide, and foliar, and a micro. When we go back on that third pass, the boys are like, oh my gosh, stick some checks out there to see if any of this stuff even pays. So we can do an on-off trial, fungicide, starter. There's lots. I've got one doing with insecticide this year. We can stick that in there to actually tell, does it pay? Oops. So in this case, this past year, that cocktail mix, something in there, caused a 10 bushel increase. Now we get to pick it apart and figure out where, right? Why? And not only did we see the increase in yield, but every time that harvester went through, the point that was picked up yielded between 240 and 242 bushels. Every single time it dropped a yield point. That's a pretty tight read. So we're pretty confident that application caused the result it did. If you don't have that capability, strip trials are fine. Stick them out there. Make sure you somehow document where they're at. One of my growers here locally, it was Blue N and Generate. Does it pay, does it not? They gave me the product, told me to trial it out. Great, let's analyze it. Let's put the dollars and cents to it. I mentioned about equipment add-ons. This is, I always get it, furrow jets. Put it on 8 rows versus the other 8 rows. Let's analyze it. Not only figure out, did it have a yield response, maybe where did it have that yield response? Because some of this stuff's pretty expensive you guys are putting on. But Yield Force has that capability to help you to understand these sort of things. But don't just run the trials, make sure it gets analyzed. And I like to say repeat. Because Yield Force and Premier's crop focus is about customer success. And we do that by increasing knowledge to make more confident decisions, to continuously improve, and sharing that learning. And despite where you're at, you can get on the bus or the wheel at any point. So that, we've been quiet. What questions do you have?
How do you determine ABC zones?
Ooh, that's good. Anybody want to pipette? I can.
Go ahead. ABC zones, so where
Speak really loud.
I'd like to see somewhere between 3 to 5 years worth of yield data, plus the rich soil sample maps if you have them, and combine that all to basically what you call like it'd be like a cumulative map, where you can see yield history. Typically we try and eliminate the bad years, so like last year, you had a field that was you got affected by the ratio. We obviously won't only include that year, any of the good years, try and combine all that into make essentially one kind of an overall generalized map of where we believe the best yield zones are, or the yield zones are. So break that down into A, B, and C zones. That's probably the simplest way to describe it.
And you can overlay other factors too, but yield, and some people are like, well, what about soil type? Well, if soil type's a yield limiting factor, it's gonna show up in your yield map, right? So,
And then as the years go, we keep updating it too.
yes.
So as more yield maps get generated year after year, we keep updating, keep up with those things.
And managing with it, management zones are such an overused word, it's almost like precision in industry. But when we talk about management zones, what we really want to get people to is marrying up the seeds with the nutrients. You're gonna put more seeds out there, you're gonna feed plants. You've pushed them into a tighter area. I think that's why variable rate seeding in the past, people like didn't see a difference. So making sure that you've got enough food out there for the seeds that you're putting out there. It's a big thing. So yeah, good question. Anything else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
America's Crops data. I know of at least 3 businesses in our area that use America's Crops.
Definitely.
Who gets to see the aggregate data from all those 3 businesses? Just anybody, or?
We can put them in a group
The
together.
more data points you have, the better off you are.
Mhm.
And that would give you a better idea of where you're at. But I don't probably have an agreement with those, between those 3 or.
So within your grower agreement, it talks about we aggregate your data. We don't have to do that if you don't want, but then you don't get access to it. So yeah, we could get a group of bigger groups that, yep. And that's right, when we start to look at it, I get asked questions a lot within the data set, like, what do you know about this? Well, first I start out in a county or and I'm like, ooh, don't have very much data. Let's widen it out until we get a better answer. So yeah. You're right. We have you have access to a large data set in this area, so we could expand that out.
Yeah, I don't know that we put any comparisons in this year, but we have done like Southeast Iowa and Illinois,
Yep.
Western Illinois comparison groups from before in years past. That pools everybody that's technically within your property into that.
And the great part is we're growing in Southeast Iowa, which means we've got more data to put in there. Yep.
When we input the financials, is that an online deal? Is it on the cloud and then?
Yes. Yep. But again,
So if
protect.
the computer crashes, you don't lose all your.
Right. Right. And again, that's aggregated data. Oh yeah, you can tell you what, going through some of these dashboards, it's like, wow, there's big differences in seed pricing. But, but it's all backed up, it's stored, it's secure. And part of, some of our partners like, why aren't you guys moving faster? I understand development has to put in, after there was a co-op in Iowa that got hacked, I think you guys had before, but like, get hijacked, right? Like ransomware, I don't know how it all works, but shut down their computers. Like, we stopped development at that point to put up another safeguard. So, I mean, we take data confidentiality and your data very serious.
When it comes to like third party, and they don't have variable rating like a fungicide, how do you look at that data to know if it was evenly applied or?
Meaning, give me an example, David.
So like, I call my ag chemical supplier,
Yep.
have him apply on fungicide.
Okay.
How do I know?
Oh, they got done?
Yeah, how do we use that data and call it data if we don't know
Well,
where all it
a
landed?
lot of those area applicators have an as applied. You hope you landed in your, but those are really hard ones, because like, what was the direction of the wind? Because they'll start out, I've looked at enough as applied. But even third party fertilizer, I mean, we can get those as applied files.
Yeah,
Yeah.
typically you can get all
Does
that.
it matter, do they have to be John Deere?
No, not at all. We've got, we have people in the room that have red equipment, yellow equipment, blue, whatever color it is. Egg day monitors, precision monitors.
Those people don't get to eat lunch, David, but they're still.
They get a different book, but.
Your
No.
others?
Yeah. But it's, even the plane app, the supply map, if you tell them you want, hey, leave a check strip, that's 2 or 3 passes wide, they can then send that back to us, that we can then overlay. So we can still see, okay, here it was, under the application, then we've got a check strip of nothing, and then they got the other side of the whole rest of the field they got applied. So the planes, most of the time, have that stuff now. And then if it's groundwork, they've all got to do that. So even if it's a flat rate, we should still have a map of it. And usually it'll read the rate, it's just a very consistent number. Like custom sprayers out there with a Raven, whatever monitor, you'll get a spray map back, and say they're going for 15 gallon acre. That map will look very close, it'll vary a little bit, but it's 14 and a half, 15 and a half most of the time. But yeah, you can't see, dead spike, or dead stop, and there's all sorts of stuff you can still get from that. Or if they had to stop for